Which Souls game is the easiest, and which one will make new players run to the nearest summon sign? Like me. MTK here, and today we are ranking the Souls games from easiest to hardest.
Dark Souls isn't hard.
Now, ranking will not include the DLCs, so Shadow of the Erdtree is not included, obviously. If you would be interested in a video including the DLCs, leave a comment, but as I go through these games, I will be ranking their difficulty based on the experience of the average player. Specifically, an average player that is new to the Souls genre, and how hard it would be for them to learn, progress, and ultimately beat the games. This seems to be the most consistent baseline since experiences vary a ton in the experienced player category. Someone who has played Dark Souls and then jumps into Elden Ring is going to have a very different experience from someone who started out in Sekiro. And there is a ton of combinations you could plug in there. So I think that a beginner's perspective is the most accurate for this topic. Now, let's rank some Souls games. Yeah! This is probably not a surprise to anyone, but Demon Souls is the easiest Souls game, and by a pretty good margin. This is the game I recommend people start on if they're looking to get into the Souls games. The easier difficulty is one reason for that, but also because it has a lot of similarities to the Dark Souls series as far as mechanics go, and it won't spoil the player with a bunch of quality of life improvements like Elden Ring tends to do. It can be kind of difficult for people to start at Elden Ring and then go back to the older games because they're just not as polished due to the age. And games like Sekiro or Bloodborne are just too different from everything else to be a good starting point. But what makes this game so much easier than its peers is the lack of very challenging boss fights, with the exception of maybe a couple. But even those aren't super tough. Don't get me wrong, it's still a difficult game, but it just doesn't have any of those very difficult fights that have you spending 50 plus attempts in order to beat them. You can also farm healing items if you so choose, and essentially remove the concern for running out of heals completely out of the game. So Demon Souls takes the first spot on the list as the easiest Souls game. Dark Souls 3 is one of my favorite Souls games ever made, and it may be because it was my first one, so it has a special place in my heart, but it's also not terribly difficult either. You can get pretty overpowered very early on, especially if you play a strength build thanks to Vort, but it does have tougher bosses than Demon Souls does, with a couple being very challenging. But it is also a lot smoother in its mechanics and has a lot of quality of life improvements that just make the game feel amazing. And the smoothness does make the game a little easier in my opinion. There's a lot less jank to wade through, so you can really just focus on the mechanics and the gameplay. So because of that, I have to give this one the next spot on the list. Elden Ring, in my opinion, should be considered for the best game of all time. It is S tier in pretty much every aspect of gaming. But in spite of having the hardest boss Fromsoftware has ever created, when it comes to difficulty, it's not so spectacular. How is that possible? Well, for one, the before mentioned boss is optional. So you don't have to fight her if you don't want to. Plus, she is hidden away in an area that many people could just race by and never even know about her. And that brings me to the main reason Elden Ring is so low on the list. Freedom. The game has plenty of very challenging bosses and areas, but since the game is open world, you can choose which order and what time you want to do them. But more importantly, you can choose at what level you want to do them. Meaning that at any time you hit a wall, you can simply just leave. Go explore, gain some levels and maybe better equipment, and then come back stronger, heaping glorious vengeance on your previous foe's head. Now, to be fair, you can do this in the other Souls games too, but it feels much more like a chore, which discourages a lot of players from doing it. But because Elden Ring is so vast, Farming levels is a joy oftentimes and happens just as a result of exploration. So for those reasons, I would say Elden Ring is heating up, but I have to give this one the easy spot on the list. Aw, Dark Souls 1, the true love of so many. I might get some flack for this, maybe not for where I'm placing it on the list, but probably for why I am placing it. Dark Souls 1, mostly due to its age, is full of jank. It's just a janky, hard time to play this game, especially if you come to it from some of the newer Souls games. The game itself, if it was smooth, is not terribly difficult, but having to sidestep all the jank to deal with the difficulty makes it much harder. And then you look down and you got jank all over your shoes and it's tracked all through your house, and will somebody clean up all this jank? So although I love Dark Souls 1 and it is a great game, it takes the pretty hard spot on the list by way of jankiness. I am a Dark Souls 2 apologist. Much of the hate on this game is unwarranted, although some of it certainly is. But it is a shame that so many people choose to quit or skip this one altogether. It is smoother than Dark Souls 1, but is definitely not without its fair share of jank either. And the way they change the directional movement causes you to miss the enemy even when you are locked on a lot of the time, which is super annoying. But its bosses are harder, the way the enemy's aggro works makes every area much harder and forces you to move at a snail's pace. Because if you try and just run by enemies like you could in Dark Souls 1, they just won't de-aggro. So you end up with a mob of angry enemies ready to punish you for your cowardice. Also, the healing is gradual instead of instant, which means you need much more space in order to heal. Not to mention the adaptability stat that will absolutely screw you if you don't know what it is and what it does. So there are a bunch of things that make this game one of the hardest games ever Fromsofted, and it takes the next spot on the list. If you've made it this far in the video, you might be having a good time. Consider leaving a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and hopefully I'll catch you on another video. Sekiro is my second favorite Souls game of all time, bested only by Elden Ring in my opinion. It's also very difficult. This is mainly because of how parry-centric it is. In other Souls games, you can mess around with builds and severely decrease the difficulty by playing a caster or a sword and board build, but not in Sekiro. Sekiro forces you to learn the timing and participate in the graceful back and forth dance that is its combat. It has some brutally difficult boss fights and areas as well. The only reason it's not in the hardest spot is that because it's so rhythmic in its gameplay, once you get the timing down and learn the flow of combat, it kind of loses a chunk of its difficulty a little. Not a lot, but some. So because of this, I have to give it runner-up. Now we come to what I believe is the hardest Souls game ever made, Bloodborne. Bloodborne has a lot of similarities to Sekiro in its combat pacing, but it is much more hectic with its timings. It seems to switch back and forth between slow, fast, and mixed enemies, so you're always having to guess and make quick decisions. The parry window is pretty tight as well, and because you have to hit it just before the enemy hits you, it makes it pretty high stakes because failing usually means that you take a chunk of damage. The bosses are brutal, some of the areas are the hardest FromSoft has to offer, plus the healing is limited. It doesn't replenish at the lanterns like other Souls games do. So it forces you to farm for heals or be subject to the elements of a no-hit run. To me, Bloodborne is the uncontested champ of difficulty, but it's also not annoying either, which is part of its brilliance. You're gonna die, and you're gonna like it. You like that? So Bloodborne takes the top spot as the hardest game Miyazaki has ever cooked up in that sick, sadistic, poison swamp infested little mind of his where your weapon always bounces off of walls, but the enemies seems to just glide straight through like a lightsaber through butter spread. And let me tell you another thing, Miyazaki.